California is never going to have spectacular population growth again, at least not in my lifetime, and I think probably not in yours. The big shift is that, the era of suburban Los Angeles is over. The era of urban Los Angeles, where people have less living space if they want to stay, except for the very wealthy, is well upon us. California added 500,000 people a year for almost 70 years. I don't know of any industrialized society that has ever grown that fast for so long. Somebody the other day quoted Ronald Reagan that if the Pilgrims had landed in California, they never would have bothered to discover the rest of the country.
Hello and welcome back to the California Future Society podcast. This week, I spoke with Bill Fulton. Bill has an incredible wealth of knowledge. It was a really fun conversation. And I think you can tell in the first couple of minutes how excited I am to speak with him. This is someone who I've read for a long time. So the chance to interview him and ask him questions about his work was just a lot of fun for me. And I think there's also a lot of practical insights, whether you're someone who just cares about the future of the housing crisis, if you're just someone who is very into the weeds on urban planning and local policy and what that looks like and where these different laws came from, or if you're someone who just thinks about how LA might evolve and how it compares to cities like Houston, where Bill worked, and how it shapes the future of the state. So it was a lot of fun in the conversation. I hope you enjoy it too. As always, you can subscribe wherever you're hearing this or at CaliforniaFutureSociety.com. Here's Bill. Well, Bill, really excited to talk to you today. I have here with me your book, The Reluctant Metropolis. This book personally means a lot to me. It was a turning point in my own thinking, helped clarify and provide a framework for a lot of the issues that California faces today. So excited to talk to you. And to start, I know you've worn a lot of hats over the years. Can you give a quick introduction to who you are and your connection to California?
Right. I've lived in California for most of the last 40 plus years. I worked at Rice University in Houston for 8 or 9 years in the middle of that. I was on the city council of Ventura for a long time. I was the planning director of San Diego. I went to planning school at UCLA. I also wrote the standard urban planning textbook for California, a Guide to California Planning. So land use and transportation planning in California and my first career was as a journalist. So researching, writing about and understanding California's growth patterns has been the major effort of my life, I guess you might say. Currently, I'm a professor of practice at the Design Lab and in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at UC San Diego, and I'm the co-director of something we just started, the Center for Housing Policy and Design at UCSD.
Well, that's part of why I'm excited to talk to you. Is it's rare to talk to someone who has not only been on both the journalism side of it, as well as some of the more, like the planning professional side of it, as well as all the different roles between academia and actually being in city council as a mayor, having these different roles all across Southern California. That's a pretty rare combination. And I think that's part of what made your book so compelling to me was the first time I read it was not just its readability. There's a lot of wonky reading and writing about land use and planning, but it is fueled by human emotions, human stories. It captured the personalities at play. And so I want to start. We're not only going to talk about this book, but I want to start here. In particular, there's a passage in the intro as I was reviewing it before this. And I'll jump around a little bit in it, but you say, so it's not so surprising that when Los Angeles finally grew so vast as to be unfathomable even to those who lived there, when the gap between the illusion of a spacious suburban lifestyle and the daily reality of a massive metropolis could no longer be papered over with dreams. The growth machine began to collapse under its own weight. And then skipping ahead a little bit, in short, the formula that had built Los Angeles so quickly no longer worked. And the reason I want to start there and ask you what you were thinking about and how that motivated the book is because today, I think people in my generation and just a lot of people who maybe haven't been following these issues as closely are wondering, how do we get here? How do we get to a state, to a region, to a political system where we're so resistant to growth and there's so many barriers and policy barriers to growth? Can you talk to that and how that emerged and where that came from and why we ended up where we are today?
Most of that goes back to the crazy growth years of the post-war era. I would say from the end of the Great Recession to the beginning, from the end of the Great Depression to the beginning of the Great Recession, California added 500,000 people a year for almost 70 years. Um, I don't know of any industrialized society that has ever grown that fast for so long. So this is ancient history, I realize, but starting in the late 50s, there began to be resistance to this dramatic growth. There was in about 1950, in 1959 was when San Franciscans successfully challenged the completion of the Embarcadero Freeway. That was really the first anti-growth pressure movement ever. Uh, there was a there was a report done about that time called California Going, Going, Gone. Um, and Between the late 50s and the early 70s, there was a growing consensus that growth was out of control and it had to be reined in. Um, there were a couple of other things that played into that. One was the rise of the environmental movement and the general approach to environmental protection that we see in the California Environmental Quality Act, which sort of begins with the assumption that the status quo is better than any possible change. Um, that was one thing. And then the other thing was California's peculiar governance structure in two ways. One was in the 70s in particular, it became a bunch of court cases came down that made it clear that the initiative and referendum process was just as powerful at the local level as at the state level, and you could change land use policy at the ballot box. And the other one was that CEQA in particular made access to the courts for practically anybody really, really easy. So one of the things that did was that made there's another aspect I'll talk about in a minute. But one of the things that did was it made it easy for what we now call NIMBYs, or people who were resistant to or skeptical of growth, to reject political compromise and either go to court and go to the ballot, where either they'd win or they'd go down in flames without compromising and feel really righteous about it. Um, the other thing that happened was the passage of Prop 13 in the late 70s, which introduced this whole concept that new growth should not have any fiscal consequences at all for the people who already lived in California, no matter whether their own growth had burdened others. Um, and that this has led to special taxes and impact fees and all kinds of burdens on new development that older homeowners do not bear. But it was this concept that it was a concept that growth is bad, any change is bad, and therefore all social, environmental, and fiscal costs should be borne by new development if we allow it at all.
I want to get back to the mechanisms that NIMBYs use and all those changes that you mentioned in CEQA. But while we're on this topic of Prop 13, I think of the chapter in your book. Anytime I drive to visit my family in the Central Coast, I grew up in the Inland Empire, but I have siblings in Santa Barbara, Ventura, and your description of Sales Tax Canyon along the 101. Can you talk more practically? I know a lot of people talk about Prop 13. They say, oh, like you're saying, it puts the burden on new growth. It warps the way that we use land. But can you talk about that practically from a city perspective, in case someone maybe doesn't know the issue as intimately or what that practically
Yeah,
means?
Prop 13 does two things which are very beneficial to homeowners, but warp the way cities approach their fiscal uh, uh, affairs. Most people know this. May not be your property tax is capped at 1% of your assessed value. And the second one is that you are not reassessed except on sale. Both of these things are very unusual nationwide. No other state has anything. I mean, I was going to say no other state has anything remotely close to this. That's not true. Other states have things that are remotely close to this. Not every state has things that are much like this. Um, so what that means is that new development, particularly if you have impact fees, gives you kind of a hit of new property tax revenue. And then over time, the property tax revenue declines in buying power and your costs increase. And sooner or later, every subdivision almost loses money, even if it makes money at the beginning. Um, but unregulated under Prop 13 or anything else is the use of the local share of sales tax. Every local government gets, we pay the underlying state sales tax is 7.25%. 1% of that is returned to the jurisdiction where the sales transaction occurs. I'll get to Amazon in a minute. So what that meant in the post Prop 13 era was that as property tax became less important, there became tremendous battles between neighboring cities often over businesses that generate a lot of retail sales and therefore a lot of sales tax. Auto dealerships, big box stores, up until recently regional malls. And in the Reluctant Metropolis, which I wrote in the 90s, I wrote about what I called Sales Tax Canyon, which was the linear area along 101 in Ventura County, where essentially Camarillo, Oxnard, and Ventura were all battling each other for these sales tax producers. Um, uh, and more recently, obviously, some of the traditionally powerful sales tax producers, especially regional malls, have declined. But now the way the sales tax distribution works is that a warehouse, like an Amazon warehouse, for example, is considered to be the point of sale.
Hmm.
And so therefore the latest battle is over Amazon warehouses. And you've seen lots of stories in the media about, some city in the Central Valley that has an Amazon warehouse that's right next to a city that doesn't, and one is well funded and relatively prosperous, at least in terms of the city's fiscal affairs, and the other one is not. But essentially, and this occurs everywhere to some extent, but because of Prop 13, it is more accentuated in California. Your ability to raise revenue off of property tax is limited and is mostly out of your control. So, but your ability to raise revenue off of sales tax is not limited, is limited only by your ability to attract retail sales producers.
Yeah. No, the point on warehouses is relevant for the area I grew up in, the Inland Empire, which is kind of the warehouse hub of Southern
Yes,
California.
right,
One of my
right.
friends, one of my friends' dads works for the city of Ontario, which has a lot of these massive warehouses, and he was just talking about how well funded the city is because whether it's QVC or all these other companies, they have their point of sale in the city, and so they generate this disproportionate amount of sales tax
Yes,
relative to the city side.
even though for a variety of other reasons there is now pushback against warehouses in the Inland Empire in particular.
Yeah, there's almost like this mini anti-growth and anti-growth
Yep,
cycle that
yep.
mirrors the broader California experience taking place out there. Um, so let's before we get too into the weeds on or I could ask a lot of different policy specific questions, but I want to talk about kind of the step back at a bigger picture, the conception of Southern California as a region. The premise of that book, The Reluctant Metropolis, it's all of these far-flung suburbs and exurbs that define themselves, in opposition to Los Angeles, yet inevitably are part of this broader place. Um, how do you feel like now, 20 plus years later, since the writing of the book, do you feel like that's shifted? I know whether it's the development of transit and some of these other initiatives that some people have argued that LA and Southern California has more of a regional identity relative to 30 years ago, or do you feel like that's not true at all? How do you think retrospectively?
I still think people's perception of where they live and what they identify with is atomized. I don't think that people in Ventura County think they're part of LA. I don't think people in Orange County think they're part of LA. I'm sure people in Redondo Beach don't think they're part of LA. But what has changed is a generational acceptance that Southern California is a more urban place. Um, what I wrote about in the growth in the Reluctant Metropolis, which is essentially a chronicle of growth wars in the 80s and 90s in LA, in Southern California. What I wrote about there was what I was really chronicling was the death of the post-war suburban development of Southern California as the region began to run out of land, as the freeways became more congested. It became harder and harder to argue that it was not a large metropolis. Also, I will say, in the 80s, it was really not until the 80s that Los Angeles itself became really viewed worldwide as a world city. A lot of it had to do with the Olympics, but I remember in the 80s there was a cover story in the Atlantic called The Big Orange, and things like that. So I think people your age, and in a certain way, reading The Reluctant Metropolis must be a surreal experience for you because it sort of explains the world you grew up in. I've talked to other people like that.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
for the people your age, the idea that Southern California is crowded and urban is not a foreign idea. For in your grandparents' generation, the generation that may have come here after World War II, that was a very foreign idea, and it was, and part of the point of living in Southern California was that you were not living in a traditional urban area. But I think the perception of people your age has changed a lot, which is part of the reason why we have this intergenerational YIMBY versus NIMBY battle right now.
It's very true on the generational point. My great grandfather moved to Upland, where I grew up, to grow oranges during the Depression. And so my grandpa described as a child there being only 5 points where they had to stop the car between Upland and the 40 miles to downtown Los Angeles. There's only, five stop crossways where they had to stop. Um, Obviously, the thought of only stopping the car 5 times is absurd to anyone growing up in my age. Yeah.
And 15 to 20 years ago, when I was doing 15 years ago, let's call it, when I was doing general plans, I did that. I was the principal in charge of the general plan and the downtown specific plan for Upland. And
Oh, really?
there were at that time, say 2010, 2009, there were still a lot of people of that generation around, and they just, they were horrified that the orange groves had gone away, and they just didn't want anything to ever change ever again still. And that really was that suburban ideal, that suburban semi-agricultural ideal really was both a pre and a post-war Southern California ideal, um, that just has been overtaken, I think, by events and reality since then.
Yeah, well, I could go on and on. I don't want to, bore people with the intricacies of upland land use because I could talk about that forever. But let's zoom out and think about the broader state because obviously, like you were saying, there's this intergenerational, energized movement around YIMBYism, and every single year it feels like they're climbing higher and higher. And earlier, one of my first interviews was with one of the directors of advocacy and research for California YIMBY. How do you feel like? I feel like in your writing, you've taken a moderate stance of state versus local control. So much of the recent YIMBY victories are premised on the concept of we're just going to override local control. The state is going to, in some form or fashion, whether it's through regional planning processes or just by right, we're going to remove a lot of the restrictions and tools that people have used traditionally at the municipal level to stop growth. Do you think there's ever a point where you can overdo it as a state and get too top down? How do you think about that dynamic and what a path forward is?
I think the path forward is probably a little more nuanced than the YIMBYs and the housing advocates in California believe, because I think I'm not the kind of person who believes that the state should have no control over land use. Obviously, something has gone wrong, um, and uh, and it has to be corrected. And part of the problem is the reluctance of local governments to entitle housing projects, right? So that has to be corrected somehow or other. So I don't dispute that. What concerns me is that it goes like this. Every year, the legislature passes more and more bills, um, essentially overriding local control. Our poor local planners in this state cannot keep up with all those changes. These planning departments are not well funded enough for them to understand and ground themselves in what's really going on. The other thing that really strikes me is that even though we've passed, starting 9 years ago in 2016, we've passed all these laws, hundreds of laws, with the exception of ADUs, housing production has not gone up. So what that tells me, and interestingly enough, if you look at the transit-oriented communities in ED1 and LA, most of the, if I'm not mistaken, this is an anecdotal impression I have, I hope it's right, most of the projects that have been approved under those programs have not been built. So there's something else going on besides entitlements, right? And I think it's time, if I could wave a magic wand, I would say it's time for the state to do two things. One is take a step back and figure out, okay, on this entitlement reform, what's really working and what's simply not working, and focus on and refine what's working and forget about the rest of it. And then try to figure out, okay, what are the post-entitlement impediments to develop to actual construction? And there are a lot of them. Interest rates, which the state can't do much about, the cost of construction materials, the general lack of construction labor, which I think the state can do something about and has not done enough about.
Yeah.
I think the state should be, there are clearly not enough construction workers. I will say as well from my experience, and I often say this, there are not enough planners or developers either. Um,
Mm.
I can tell you, and again, this is a somewhat anecdotal impression, but a large number of planners and developers left the field in California during the Great Recession and have never come back. And the number of planners and developers in California today, I think, is not what it was in 2008. So the capacity of the system to do all this is much more limited than it used to be. And I think the state has to figure out how to encourage um, how to encourage post entitlement action. Uh, an obvious thing for the state to do would be to work with the Carpenters Union and others to really ramp up apprenticeship programs and so forth. Another thing that I've come to realize recently, which is not a California specific problem, is um, construction techniques and supply chain systems in the construction industry are ancient and probably need to be dramatically revised and updated. Um, uh, we still build houses and provide housing building supplies to construction sites now pretty much the same way we did when I was born. And and so there are a lot of post entitlement things that have to happen. The legislature seems to be entirely focused on entitlement because that's something they can easily control. And that is part of the problem. But I think we've gotten to the point where we've we've passed hundreds of bills. Production hasn't really gone up with the exception of ADUs. And so I think it's time to take a look at what else is wrong with this system.
I want to ask you about the politics of growth. You mentioned the Carpenters Union, and so many people I talk to when it comes to state politics um, feel frustration to varying degrees to which they're willing to speak about it publicly. But the role of unions in negotiating and scoping some of the bills, whether it's requiring prevailing wage, and just stepping back without wading into the politics of today, I find that really interesting because if you look at the let's say like the Pat Brown era post-war California growth machine, unions were a key pillar of that because more growth, more opportunity, was aligned with their interests. But it seems that with the exceptions of some of the carpenters unions today, those alignments have really shifted fundamentally. How do you make sense of that?
I think that's hard to make sense of. Of course, in the post-war era, not most, but a large percentage of the workforce was unionized. Um, and we were in a completely, as the tariff battle reminds us every day, we were in a completely different competitive situation with the rest of the world. We dominated the world economy, which we don't today. So I think what both public and private unions today are sort of playing defense all the time, right? You can see that prevailing wage is put into a lot of this housing reform because it's an end run around CEQA, and the unions use CEQA to blackmail developers to get PLAs and other pro-union things. You take that away from them, they have to have something else, and so that's why you have prevailing wage. There has been some discussion about a residential prevailing wage that might be lower, right? I think something has to give there. And the unions themselves are not always in alignment with each other. My experience has been that the trades are pretty recalcitrant, whereas the carpenters union is much more willing to play ball. Um, uh, you would think, for example, that factory-built housing would be part of the solution, right?
Yeah.
Because it's much.
Last week, I just interviewed someone who, or I guess it'll be 2 weeks before this episode, someone who's doing kind of an innovative new factory built housing model.
Right. You would think that that would be um, part of the solution. The unions are split on that, right? So I do think that part of the issue is the unions take a somewhat narrow perspective, right? Understandably, they are representing their members. Um, uh, but a world where most people are not union members, and where people who are not union members who attempt to buy or rent houses have to bear the higher cost, I think that raises some questions about what's the best way to approach the situation. I think it is, and we're so much more polarized as a society around issues like labor issues that I think that becomes very difficult to resolve. I do think one of the things I've seen in my career is the increase in the use of CEQA by the unions. And similar to the use of CEQA by NIMBYs to simply stop projects, I guess it seems to me to be a use of CEQA that is probably not in the original spirit of the law. I'll put it that way.
Well, let's touch on SQL before we move on. Is it's a hot topic right now. It's kind of considered this third rail for a long time. Like you
Yeah,
can't
it
touch
was.
SQL, you can't change it. And now this year, the governor coming out and saying, "Hey, as part of my budget, I'm going to include these two bills from Senator Weiner and Assemblymember Wicks that would essentially, simplifying the streamlining or eliminating CEQA for large multifamily infill, so building large units in existing cities." How does that shock you? I know you've written about the topic and the need to reform CEQA over the years.
No,
Does it surprise you?
it doesn't surprise me. It's been a movement. Once you took the unions out of the picture with prevailing wage, um, the opposition diminishes. Um, I will say the frustration that I've seen is when the legislature doesn't do anything about CEQA, except when one particular project becomes a big issue, and then they punch a hole in CEQA. I've called that Swiss cheese CEQA, right? So
Yeah.
when the state lost two court cases about the expansion, the new capital annex, two CEQA court cases. And John Laird, of all people, a very reliable liberal Democrat from Santa Cruz, takes charge and says, well, we must exempt CEQA. We must exempt this project from CEQA because it's costing the state $5 million a month to not build this. You think, well, what's different about the capital annex from every housing project in the state, right?
Yeah, every
Obviously,
developer is screaming at their TV
right,
or computer or whatever
right,
like that. We've been saying this for decades. Yeah.
right. And I guess my attitude about CEQA is um, you should protect the environment. You should ensure that people have a say. But is this really the way to do it? It's kind of an outdated way to do things at this point, in my opinion. Doesn't mean you shouldn't protect the environment. Doesn't mean you shouldn't have give people a say. What's happened in San Diego, where I live now, is the city has moved a lot of the CEQA analysis and the public debate up to the plan level. And if a project conforms to the plan, it's ministerial in approval. And that's hard for a lot of longtime activists to deal with because that's not what they're used to. But I've always said, and other CEQA experts going back to the 90s have always said, that that is preferable to have that debate at the plan level and then just projects get built afterwards. It's a
That way
little
you're
bit
not
complicated,
debating every single plan.
right? Every single project. It's a little bit complicated by the fact that the state has so many density bonuses and so forth. So it's a little difficult to know what's actually going to emerge from the plan because what can get built could be much bigger, right? So,
That's something that's currently has my neighborhood a buzz is a ED1 project. I live in West LA and near Sawtell Stoner Park, and an ED1 project that got approved, and then they stacked all the density bonuses on as any developer
right,
would, and so
right.
it's an eight story unit without parking that has some of my neighbors in a tizzy. and showing up at the park across the street from
Yeah,
my
I
house
think
to.
I think that's one of the things that makes today trying to sequelize the plan level is that the ultimate outcome with all the bonuses and stuff is a little hard to predict.
Well, we might have lost anyone who wasn't into intricacies of land use law by this point in the conversation, but I want to zoom out. I know you spent some significant time in Houston thinking about it. What are the lessons from Houston? It gets held up as this alternative, non-zoning
Right.
paradise for YIMBYs, but what are the practical lessons that you learned comparing Houston to the cities that you lived in Southern California?
It's interesting. I moved to Houston in 2014, and at that time, Houston was generally viewed by most urbanists as a laughingstock that wasn't to be taken seriously. And by the time I left in 2023, it was being held up as a model of a regulation light that allows
Maybe
development to
maybe it's because
occur.
you were there, Bill. I don't know.
No,
That could have been the correlation.
I don't think that was a correlation, but not a causation. My experience in Houston tells me that um, a couple things about when the market dominates as opposed to the regulation. One is that good things and bad things happen really fast. Good things happen really fast, and bad things happen really fast. The other is that just because there's light regulation doesn't mean developers are going to build um, all different kinds of housing at all different price points. What developers in Houston know how to build are fairly expensive townhomes in the center, in which I lived in one, 5/1 fairly expensive apartments, which I also lived in one, more than one, and relatively inexpensive suburban homes at the fringe. That's what they know how to build, so that's what they build, and they build it and build it and build it and build it. That may or may not be what the market, what people need. It's what the market. It's what they know how to build, and they know there's a market for. Um, what's I think what's missing is more different housing types for more different people at more different price points, because that's just not what builders build. Remember, developers and builders usually have particular product types they specialize in, that they know how to build, and they just want to build that over and over and over and over again. Um, the other thing I found was many of the big multifamily developers that are active in California are based in Houston. Camden is based in Houston. Hanover is based in Houston. Others. And what they always told me off the record was, "Yeah, we do our worst work in Houston." And I said, "Why would you do your worst work in your hometown?" They said, "Because nobody's forcing us to do anything better. We know when we go to LA, we got to up our game. But in Houston, we know we can just build the basic stuff and get away with it." So I think there's a lot of pros and cons. I think there are some lessons from Houston. Houston was not by any means a completely free market. There was a lot of parking requirements, a lot of setback requirements. Um, uh, but I think there's a lot of lessons pro and con about a market-oriented approach. And I think in California, a somewhat more market-oriented approach, learning some lessons from Houston is probably a good thing.
What does the world, what do cities look like in the next generation after sprawl? It seems like in Southern California, to oversimplify, we had Spanish ranches that then became farms, that then became like the sprawling subdivisions. And I know you've thought a lot about this question, but are there models that Southern California, Houston, or other sprawling Sunbelt or Southern American cities can look to as examples of what an evolution looks like, for a city that works a little better and is a little bit more affordable?
That's a good question. I think that you're going to see, first of all, sprawl won't stop completely. Um, and particularly in a world where some people do not have to commute or do not have to commute very often, you're going to see more sprawl. You'll see more development in the Antelope Valley. You'll see more development in Banning and Beaumont. I used to think of Moreno Valley as the kind of the outer limit, right? But now you see a lot of development through on the other side of the pass in Beaumont and Banning. So you're going to see that to a certain extent. I think you're also going to see. I always think of. I always think of the typical Southern California suburban HOA subdivision as kind of a petrified forest, right? Or a freeze-dried subdivision that, it's basically impossible to change anything. But I do think what you're going to see in those places, because the state has overridden the locals and the HOAs, is you're going to see a lot of ADUs. I think that's probably in the existing suburban communities. That's the biggest change you're going to see. And not all of them will be on the market as rental housing. A lot of them will be housing for extended families. A lot of them will be just extra, essentially an addition to your house, extra space to use as an office or whatever. And then you're going to see, as we already see, intense infill residential development in places where you can make it pencil, such as West LA. Um, so I think you see all of the above going on. What that adds up to, other than a much more urban, slightly more sprawling, but significantly more dense, uh, still mostly auto-oriented region. I think that's what it is. My view about the LA light rail system, which is now gigantic but pretty slow,
Hmm.
is that 100 years from now, it's going to be viewed as a fabulous investment. Um, in the meantime, most people don't live near stations, and so I think it will not blossom in the next 10 or 20 years as much as everybody hoped. But in 50 or 100, I think it saves the region, to be honest with you.
I agree on the light rail. I live near the Expo line station in West LA, and it's just changed my relationship to downtown
Yeah.
and the rest of the city. That other parts that feel impenetrable during those peak traffic hours
Yeah.
now are more accessible.
If you can access it, it's tremendously valuable.
Yeah.
I live in downtown San Diego. I go to the campus a lot. The Any other way of getting to the campus is a big pain in the neck, but you can take the light rail and it drops you off actually literally right next to the building that my office is in. So if you can access it, it can completely change your relationship to the city. But most people, that is not the case for most people.
Switching gears a little bit, how much do you think about demographics and the future of cities in California, or just the future of California itself? So there's this broader conversation around slowing birth rates. And then in California, particularly, if you don't already own a home or have family who's already own a home, like figuring out how to start a family and live here, or, there's already been a lot of documentation of the working class leaving, um, and people who can't afford to stay. How do you think this will shape the future of the state going forward?
Well, I think I've said this before, and I've written about it. I wrote about this in Slate. California is going to become more like a place like New York, where people with big dreams and big aspirations will move here, no matter what no matter the financial uh, financial barriers. Um, but most of the people who live here are going to be people whose families live here and who grew up here. Um, and that it fundamentally changes things. And a lot of those people, of course, are leaving. So I think, number one, California is never going to have spectacular population growth again, at least not in my lifetime, and think probably not in yours. We're just going to have to get used to the idea that California's population grows slowly, if at all. Um, and then we have to, as I've written about in the LA Times, we have to untether ourselves from the idea that that new growth will pay for everything, right? Because there won't be that much of it, and we can't bail ourselves out with it. And finally, you wonder, the other similarity to New York is, and I think this is already happening to a certain extent, people who are from here, whose families are here and want to stay here, begin to get accustomed to a different lifestyle. Either they commute extremely long distances, or they live in smaller living spaces, like they do in Tokyo, like they do in New York, like they do in other major worlds, like they do in San Francisco, like they do in other major world cities. I think that is going to be the big shift. Is that the era suburban Los Angeles is over, and the era of urban Los Angeles, where people have less living space if they want to stay, is except for the very wealthy, is well upon us for
I feel
sure.
like there's weird social and psychological effects when you experience that transition in real time, right? When the city already exists that way and you move to Tokyo and people just live in small units. There's no expectation of having a yard near downtown or anything of that nature. People just accept it. That's what the city is. That's what New York is. But I feel like living through this transition. And for people like myself, whose parents and grandparents had a certain standard of living, just knew, oh, well, if you live in the SoCal area and you have an average wage, you can own a home. You can
Yeah.
own this type of, it's that feeling of loss of a relative material well-being, I think is very difficult for a lot of people to navigate.
It is difficult for a lot of people, but I do think the YIMBY generation, such as your generation, is going to have a different attitude, which is, okay, I want to stay in California. I want to stay in Southern California. Um, I'd rather live in a townhome or a two-bedroom apartment than in my parents' basement
Yeah,
or in Phoenix, right?
yeah,
And so there is an accept or there is a I think a gradual acceptance generationally of a different lifestyle. And in order to make that work, and I know you talked to Rick Cole a while ago, and he would
yeah,
be a big advocate of this too. In order to make that work, the neighborhood fabric, the community amenities have to be strong, um, and they have to be rewarding to people so that what what they might be losing by not having a backyard, they gain by living in a very vital neighborhood or community with a lot of things to do and a lot of places to go.
yeah. Rick definitely would resonate. He was talking about, Amish barn raisings and all types of other community features. That's very Rick.
I didn't know they had any Amish barn raisings in Pasadena, but
No,
okay.
no, well, not in Pasadena, but as a model of
Yeah.
community connection. Yeah, that was a fun conversation speaking with him. And you were just laying out this vision of what the future of SoCal and the state looks like. What gives you hope for the future of California, and what, yeah, gets you most excited about the future of the state?
What gives me hope is that even the people who are leaving still want to live here. You know, somebody um, somebody the other day quoted Ronald Reagan, a quote I'd never heard of, that if the Pilgrims had landed in California, they never would have bothered to discover the rest of the country. You know, that people want to live in California, and the only reason they don't live, the main reason they don't live here is because housing. So if we can crack that nut to some extent, then California will continue to be, and we still have an extremely vibrant economy. So, and we are still the world center of innovation, and especially technological innovation. So if we can even partially crack the housing problem, then we have a vibrant future. The future will be different than the past. It'll be more urban. It'll be more of a hassle for a lot of people, but it will still be a great place to live if we can make enough houses available at a reasonable price to enough people. And that gives me hope.
As one quick follow on, what do you think we can reasonably achieve that, and what does that look like? Like, are we at the worst of the housing crisis? I guess is what I'm asking.
I think we're actually just past the worst. For a variety of reasons, prices are stagnant now. And if you're trying to solve this problem, part of the problem is to make sure housing prices stagnate while incomes go up. Whether incomes are going to go up in the next few years is anybody's guess. But we've seen that happen in the past in California. We saw it happen in the 90s. Prices stagnated for 7 or 8 years, but it was a very prosperous time, and incomes went up. So I think that what we see is more housing constructed, more different types of housing constructed. We got to find ways to. We really are, in the words of the book, stuck. A lot of people just aren't moving. We have to create more mobility. But I think that those are the kinds of things that we can move on. What the entitlement problem is still there, but we've worked on it for a long time. If we can move on to start to crack the other aspects of this problem, then we begin to see more houses, more types of houses, different types of houses in the past for more people who have more opportunity to stay because California is still a place where people want to live.
Awesome. Well, Bill, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Sure.